Milton Acorn and the free speech movement. Did you know it was illegal to read poetry out loud on a Sunday afternoon in a public park in the city of Toronto before 1962? This is the story of Milton Acorn and how that all changed. "I shout loud at petals peeled open," Milton Acorn said. Maybe this was a bellow and maybe it was a lilt, but it definitely was the missile that broke through a silence so loud it left all of us a legacy, invaluable, incalculable, and precious. What it really was an act of civil disobedience. This whole story had to do with the Orange Order, the battle between Catholics and Presbyterians, Protestants brought over from Ireland, begetting a battle for morality expected of all Ontario's population of that time. Because the dominant population was Irish, this code of moral behavior was foisted on each and every citizen in Ontario, Canada. The setting for this epic tale? Downtown Toronto. The saga begins in Allen Gardens. The protagonist, described by Robert Priest, was, quote, "a burly fellow with a face that might have been carved by a woodcutter's axe from a particularly grainy tree stump," end of quote. Date and place. It was 1962, July the 12th. At the foot of the statue of Robbie Burns off Sherbourne Street, south of Carleton, there were laws in place, and Toronto, trying to abide by the laws, was Toronto the good. For reciting poetry out loud, repeat after me, for reciting poetry out loud, Milton, I knew him, I could call him familiarly Milton, was ticketed and fined. The crime was speaking without a permit in a public park. Preachers could preach, but not poets. Imagine being fined in 1962 $30 to $100 for reading poetry out loud in a public park. Whispers, anyone? Then he did it again and was fined. Then he read from the Song of Solomon and made headlines and changed the world as it was. Milton carried on. He occupied the park. He was. Idle never was. He kept on reading and reciting in the crowd. Maybe a few eyewitnesses didn't disperse, and they kept listening, and they changed history. Maybe you and I take for granted what Milton Acorn did with just the power of his voice, the passion of his beliefs, the brilliance of his vision, but this was no mean feat. If, as is said, the pen is mightier than the sword, then Milton's voice was rapier sharp. Toronto and this aspect of history became idle no more. 50 years and counting. July 12, 1962, Canadian-born poet, Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, the Maritimes-bred, Marxist-informed Milton Acorn poet, became the people's poet. Named by his peers, Margaret Atwood, Irving Layton, Joe Rosenblatt, and more. The ceremony was held in legendary Grossman's Tavern. Some who walk or drive or bike past the statue of Robbie Burns erected in 1902 don't know or care or take for granted what a historical event took place with one live and another bronzed poet. Truly, should old acquaintance never be forgotten where the original reading took place? I heard that thousands attended these readings of resistance in 1962. Was it the reading that was of resistance or the activism? I wonder. I shout love, he may be brayed. I shout love is the ultimate act of activism. Do you shout love and then stand your ground when you are admonished and charged by incomprehensible laws? I take this for granted. People come from far and wide for this privilege, to shout love and shame love in a public park. Milton showed us what kind of a society we created. We, the people, collectively created this, and we, the people, not just resist, but change the laws of the land, and so we did. Back then, Acorn continued his poesy, his verses, his love of life and all that lives. The finds nevertheless continued, Sunday after Sunday. The people kept coming, like a moccasin trail beating in the hearts of the citizenry who were longing for more than a just society, but a society of integrity, integration, inevitability. Milton's shouts and genius drew larger crowds and more media. The mantra started with a shout of love and grew to a crescendo of freedom of speech. Other poets joined in. This became a protest, pre-hippie, on the cusp happening, eventually being covered by the media, read about in newspapers, talked about everywhere, coast to coast, before Facebook and Twitter. Like any great irreversible revolution, officials of the city of Toronto saw the significance of this bad publicity and the unflinching tenacity of Milton and his call to arms poetry, and the bylaws of the city of Toronto were changed. The pen, the thought, the passion, the person is mightier than the sword. One person can change the course of history. The people together can and will. Clearly, I owe Milton a debt of gratitude. I was a young teenager navigating my way to adulthood in a society that still posted signs on the beach, no dogs or Jews allowed. I drank with Milton and the crew of Toronto Workshop Productions and never understood this disheveled man and what he did for me, for us. I didn't thank him then, I thank him always now. Robert Priest says, quote, "A clearly tormented man, Acorn, who railed against war and inequality, would have loved Occupy, was sometimes inarticulate with rage. He told me once in one of his moments of clarity and connection about the sonic impact of a shell blast he experienced aboard a ship in the Second World War, an injury that affected his brain health ever after and no doubt contributed to his early demise in his hometown of Charlottetown in 1986, age 43. End of quote. Karma, the law of cause and effect, is redolent and absolute. In the year 2012, on July 12, 50 years to the day of Milton's act of civil disobedience, police were summoned to the same statue of Robbie Burns at a time when a tribute to Milton was going on in Allen Gardens. 3 poems into Milton's book, a contretemps with no relation to the reading developed, interrupting the reading. Some Allen Garden regular and a resident of nearby Seton House got into a violent altercation. There was head kicking, bottles being thrown and used as weapons. One bloody man walked right into the middle of Sherbourne Street traffic, blood pouring from his nose, and sat down. The proximity of the poetry, the living spirit of Milton Acorn and drama and history still unfolding, roused the poets to express their humanity, compassion, and sense of peacekeeping until the ambulance arrived. Ironically, this time it was the poets who called the police. I know. I have a cell phone and was the first to notice and draw stubborn attention to this fracas, and couldn't concentrate on the poetry until this skirmish was dealt with. I don't like fist fighting, I'm a warrior with words and ideas and will fight for my rights as a human being. Soon the police arrived. This fracas wasn't an act of civil disobedience unless one thinks of the rights of those wanting to bash someone else's head in as a human right. As a musician-poet, Kent Bowman said, quote, "I think Milton would have been pleased with the outcome and the chaos," end of quote. I hope so. It's funny in hindsight. Acorn said, "I shout love even though it might deafen you, and never say that love's a mild thing, for it's hard, a violation of all laws for the shrinking of people." Terry Barker, thank you for teaching me about the history of my homeland, my poemland, my city, my people, and the onus of my responsibility.